And now I'll be handing things over to Kathleen Murphy. She is the director of the Center on KTDRR, and she's carried out this role for us in the past and has done a great job of moderating the discussion session. Kathleen, are you ready to take it over?
Hey there. So Joanne, this is Kathleen. Joanne and I are actually sitting around the same table, so I'm getting close to the phone so everybody can hear me. So we're going to launch into the last session of the afternoon. And the point of this time together is we have a chance to digest all we're learning and try to come up with ways that we can think about how there are cross-cutting themes across the presentation, how they apply to our own work. So we do have some questions that we brought up in the registration, and we'll also try to be addressing those. In addition to myself on the phone, we have Dahlia Shaewitz, who is the managing director at the American Institutes for Research. Dahlia, are you with us?
I'm here. Hi there.
Hi, Dahlia. And I know June Gothberg, the Principal Research Associate from the National TA Center on Transition at Western Michigan University, was online earlier today. June, have you been able to call in and join the conversation?
Yeah. Hello.
Wonderful. Hi, June. Thanks for joining us. Now, Claudia Diaz, are you with us on the phone? Or because we didn't see you log on earlier, and perhaps something has come up today for Claudia, and she hasn't been able to join us. But I just thought I'd check to see if she was. No. Claudia? Okay. So if she does join in, we'll integrate Claudia into the conversation. But we do have, throughout the week, some other representatives from the ADA Center systems, so we look forward to engaging with them. To warm us all up, we're going to start with a couple of polls to get a sense of who's in the room with respect to what might inform our conversation today. So for poll 1, what role best describes your reason for attending this conference? Are you a researcher, or perhaps you're a knowledge translation professional, which some people may not know that actually is an occupation that's emerging in recent years. Perhaps you're a technical assistance provider or trainer. You may be a clinician, service provider, or practitioner. And I know I often design surveys and people love to be others, so that's just fine. But tell us about it in the chat box. What distinguishes you from those other roles? So we do have some other here. Natalie DeMeo is a research coordinator in a producer group research department with new responsibilities in knowledge transfer. So that'll be interesting to hear more about. Yes, I mean, we understood coordinator, right. Okay, but it looks like we've got about 4 in 10 of you are researchers, a quarter are KT professionals, 1 in 5 are clinicians, service provider, practitioners, and then 7% TA providers and trainers. And Melanie is a scientific writer also with new responsibilities in KT. Okay, so while people finish out that poll, I wanted to introduce the presenters that may have been able to join us back on the phone. So we've heard first today from Chris McBride. Chris, were you able to call back in?
Yep, I'm here.
Great. And Ron Saunders, are you on the phone line with us as well?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. And Jennifer Flagg, have you been able to stay on?
Yep, I'm here.
Good. So we have one other poll. And because so much of this afternoon had to do with audiences, we thought it would be good to get a sense of what audience you try to primarily engage in your KT activities. So we recognize that for some of you, this question maybe doesn't apply to you if you're not actually engaged in KT activities, so that's fine if you want to click on that. KTDRR does a survey every year of NIDALA grantees, and we ask this question of them, and the most highly ranked audience as far as numbers is always other researchers, so we have that here. And then second for NIDALA grantees typically is clinicians or service providers. We thought we'd include policymakers as sets of enduring interest. And typically for NIDALA grantees, the third audience that they try to reach is people with disabilities and or their families. And this is, of course, is when we force a choice. Lauren, you might want to scroll down so that people can see that they could also choose some of these other audiences on the poll, which would be businesses. Okay, so let's go ahead and end the poll, Lauren. Great. So we've definitely got a mix of audiences here that people are trying to reach. And so I think we can go ahead and kick off the discussion now that we have a sense of the diversity of our participants and the audiences that they're trying to reach. So we sent these questions ahead of time to June and Dahlia to think through, since the theme for today is overcoming barriers to outreach, how do you think these presentations relate to NIDALA grantees or others who work in the field? Dahlia, I know you've been prepping for this, so did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share with the group?
What I found most fascinating about all three of the presentations was this real focus on stakeholders involving people with disabilities or clinicians or whoever that audience is, engaging them in meaningful ways, not just in non-meaningful ways. So what I found particularly of interest was Ron's slide 14, where he showed the stakeholder engagement spectrum. And I've always thought of it as a research continuum and where can we plug in our stakeholders. But he really talks about it in a three-dimensional way, not only where we can plug them in, but how deep can we get in that engagement. And Chris also talked about very deep engagement. And then I'm going to mess up the name, Laura Flagg, also talked about it, but in terms of how to get that alpha testing, beta testing, efficacy throughout the stages of development. So I'm not sure I'm quite answering your question, but I really thought this was a very interesting theme that carried through all three presentations. And I guess what I'd really like to know at some point from the presenters is where have they seen some really innovative, successful engagement strategies in each of their domains?
Well, would any of the presenters like to answer, Dahlia?
I don't know about innovative, but maybe actually just asking research users questions is innovative sometimes. I just think there's a lot of really good examples of people who've taken the time and care to approach this in the right way that makes them stand out against, I'll call them competitors because people are competing for resources in community organizations like mine. So the people that stand out are the people that do it well, and it's not necessarily innovative. That's an innovative response that's required, but it's just more a human and personal connection that's created.
Yeah, that was my.
Chris speaking, right? Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Ron. Here, yeah, that was my hesitation too, with the word innovative. I think there's a lot of people who are committed to doing integrated knowledge transfer and exchange, with building relationships and involving people in meaningful ways. And frankly, to some extent, the growth of that depends on funders, right? I mean, that to the extent that people who are the funders of research grants demand that, then more of it will happen. But they need to demand it not only in grant applications, they need to be following up to make sure people are really doing it. But if more funders are committed to that, then that will create an incentive for more people to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hi, this is Jennifer, and sort of piggybacking on this, and one of the themes we saw throughout the discussions today was that integrated KT is really critical. And so that may not be innovative, but certainly in our experience, we've seen a lot of grantees working on development projects sort of in isolation. They may be involving consumers and other stakeholders in the development process, but perhaps they're not engaging a transfer partner or a manufacturer until they have a prototype in hand. And what we're seeing, well, what we've seen in the past is that often leads to failure, either because they weren't aware of something that the company was developing, or their output just isn't something that can be realistically produced. So now we're seeing a shift where more and more grantees are involving manufacturing partners at the onset of their projects. And as a result of that, we're seeing more success, which of course leads to these products getting to the market and into the hands of people with disabilities to improve quality of life.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. This is Dahlia again. I had one other comment, and it's always coupled with a question. I think that technology transfer, reaching out to markets, engaging people in research, non-researchers in research, can sometimes be a challenge for researchers who haven't received training to be able to do that. And I've always been of the mind that not everyone on the research team needs to do the outreach. Not everyone on the research team needs to know how to bring things to market. You just need some people on the research team to do that. And we've run into barriers like having enough time and seeing the connection between engaging stakeholders and then seeing the success that comes from that, the impact. So I wonder if the presenters could also speak a little bit about what barriers they've seen with that engagement with stakeholders and how they've seen it successfully overcome.
Great. Well, this is Jen. I just have to jump in there. So you'd mentioned that not all stakeholders on the research and development team need to be involved, and you're absolutely right. I think what we've seen, though, is that often there isn't anyone on the team who has business or marketing or sort of that experience in talking with the manufacturers, and that's where the stumbling block occurs. So in any research project, if you had to do some statistical analysis and you didn't have that capability on your team, you'd bring that in. Similarly, if you don't have the business expertise on your team, bring that in, whether that's collaborating with the business department at your university, leveraging your tech transfer office. We've seen some grantees who are very successful with working with their TTO early on in the project to really sort of identify the market, the potential partners. But if you leave that to the end, it's just a recipe for disaster.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And in the chat, Heather Gainforth is pointing out, great point, it will be challenging to know, what's in quotes, which researchers need to engage and what level of skill is required for all researchers to be able to see the value in the integrated knowledge translation occurring on the team. June, did you want to chime in here? I don't want to leave you out of the conversation. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Sure. I didn't want to interrupt. So when I thought about today and that the goal is around that knowledge transfer and overcoming those barriers for that, I thought that Dr. Saunders had a really good point that one of the outcomes for today is really thinking about planning for measuring your impact. So not just the implementation phase, but looking at what kind of impact these funded projects have. And as a funder, NIDLR is really interested in funding outcomes more than those inputs. So for potential grantees, I think this is really helpful because it points out that you need to plan for that evaluation component during your logic model process. And then I just thought Dr. Flagg brought it home, looking at that framework and continuum of how to get from the planning phase all the way to the impact phase. So thinking about that business case and applying it to all the projects could be really helpful, thinking about planning for that. How are you going to know whether or not you made a difference from inception, rather than, you know, trying to think of it as an add-on. So that's how I thought this would really apply to the grantees and looking at that field work.
Great, thanks, June. Were there any reactions to her? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I do want to integrate some of the questions we promised that came up earlier. We would try to address those in this time during the day. So, Dahlia, to your point about innovation and innovative strategies, and Chris, your use of the videos as a way that researchers could try to recruit to their studies. You know, Heather Gainforth and Lisa Engel both, implicit in their reaction to the suggestion was that it is innovative because they're imagining that their research ethics board or institutional review board will be unfamiliar with this kind of subject recruitment. So have you had, how did those researchers handle getting IRB approval for the use of these videos? Did they submit a script ahead of time, or how did that work? Do you know?
No, they didn't. Because we did the videos, and we weren't actually involved in those research projects, so we were kind of outside of I guess, the ethics issues. But that said, I'm not sure that the researchers themselves were. So we didn't have any issues or any consequences to doing those videos, but it probably warrants more exploration from the academic side to know how that should be handled properly from their end.
So has anyone, you know, on the line or in the chat box done innovative kind of subject recruitment where, you know, you really had to explain a lot ahead of time? Like typically you do need to get approved ahead of time, your consent letter, the little, you know, tweets or Facebook posts you might be hosting, the things, Chris, that you get where people are asking you, could you forward this to your email list, has been approved ahead of time.
Yeah, and everything we receive, that kind of stuff that we receive has been approved, but when we're taking information and translating it for our members, I guess it's interesting because we're not really bound by any of those restrictions unless we're actually involved in the research project itself. So it's a bit of a gray area.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I do think, and this is just, you know, based on my experience in the IRBs I've dealt with, I think to try to, you know, address the question that if one were to develop the script for the video and submit that and describe and then get kind of a preliminary approval, because of course you don't want to invest in the video if the IRB isn't going to approve it, and then then they watch the video and say it's okay. I would imagine that would work out, although I'm not an IRB member, so I welcome anyone who might be listening in and have access to the chat box who is a member of an IRB to chime in and give their perspective. I think others who are researchers who are participating today would find that helpful. Yeah, so Heather's saying, I think the script or key messages would be approved and it shouldn't be a problem.
I agree with that.
Yeah, so Lisa, the script, would it decrease the humanized aspect of the video, the part of the video that was very engaging? I think probably someone could get familiar with it, and, you know, that as long as they didn't, adapt it in such a way that it changed the content. I don't think you would have to voice the script totally verbatim. But again, that would be something to negotiate with your IRB. So Heather's saying we get to keep messages that our partners used approved and say they can distribute via their own media channels. Well, there you go. Okay. So there's obviously, like everything with knowledge translation, different ways to go about this. It gets complex and it looks different almost every single time. Right, and Catherine Sibley is pointing out, I think you couldn't go wrong by trying to engage the Research Ethics Board as you are developing your plan for this. In other words, as I think about it, you know, Chris, you're saying talk to us early and often. I think IRBs appreciate that as well because they consider themselves to be one of these stakeholders that are part of this engagement process.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
So, Kathleen,
ahead.
this is Dahlia. There was one other thing that really jumped out at me, and it was Ron's slide 8, where he talked about the 4 pillars, and the third one was what researchers mean by. And I found it so fascinating because I work with many researchers who like to be very precise in their language. And yet we saw examples of videos, and one was really fun to watch a researcher having a hard time explaining something, but in a real human way. That can be a challenge sometimes to translate information in a way that's relatable, palatable for a general audience or a particular stakeholder, because when we make it more relatable, we lose that precision of language and it feels less exact. And I'm just wondering if the presenters or anyone in the audience has addressed that, and how have you addressed that?
I mean, I think it's Ron speaking. I think it is a real art, to be able to take research, the language that researchers use, and turn that into language that knowledge users can access and apply while being faithful to the methodology, right? While being accurate and faithful to the methodology. I think it's a real art. I think we are very fortunate at the Institute for Work and Health that we have a communications manager who is superb at that art. It takes a lot, but it takes a lot of effort to sort of painstakingly sometimes go through multiple back and forth, with scientists about, but can we use this phrase instead? So I don't have a formula for it, but I think it is doable in terms of remaining faithful to the precision of the work while expressing it in language that stakeholders can access.
Sure.
I would just add that
go ahead.
Sorry, it's Chris. I would just add that it's not always just the language. I mean, tone is a component of language, and that's a really important piece when you're trying to connect with, like for us with our membership. We try to use a certain type of tone in our language, and that's an extra nuance that's really hard. So it's not always just the words, but how you're using the words.
Could you give an example?
I guess this is where the balance with precision comes in. But we just would articulate a sentence in a way that would be more conversational than it would be technical, just as an example. So you can use different kinds of words, but you could also structure it in a way that would be more familiar to our readers or our viewers.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Like for perhaps conveying research findings could be framed by questions and then the answer to the question.
Yeah, and you might make it friendlier, like throw in a couple of extra bits that make it friendlier, for example. It's kind of hard to describe that, but that's an important.
I think I know what you're talking about. I'm going to plug. Jess Chaikin is a very active participant in these KT conferences, and she writes a newsletter for the National Rehabilitation Information Center, NARIC.com, and I think that is a good example of what you're talking about if anybody wants to check out. She's waving to us, the news and notes that she raised. So I had another, this is Dahlia, when you were asking about, does a research team have the capacity to engage in some of this outreach? A similar question could be asked, Ron, when you have your arrow that, people like, and a lot of discussion around it, as you can see. Do you think that, that there need to be selection criteria around who could play those different roles, or that it's more the job of the project that research capacity might need to be built among volunteers or, partners who are going to get involved in various aspects of the project all the way to co-PI? Or see where I'm going with this?
I think so. Well, we do sometimes target individuals within the key stakeholder communities if we're looking for, particular capacity, right? So some stakeholders may be asked to play a stronger role than others would. I suppose an example would be, if we're doing a systematic review of the literature on some topic, and we might have a multi-stakeholder advisory committee, but we might also have some stakeholders that, from our experience, have demonstrated a sufficient sort of understanding of research methods or have participated in our systematic review workshops to actually be a reviewer in the sense that they are in there with the research team in terms of assessing the relevance and quality of articles that are part of the, systematic review. So you could have different stakeholders playing stronger roles depending on, their capacity, their expertise.
And do you provide the training then to those systematic team members?
Well, I mean, for all of the team members, we would provide a kind of overview of the of how the process works and how what the methods are at a high level. I mean, so the Stakeholder Advisory Committee would get that as well. But we also do these workshops, right? So we also do these workshops on how to conduct a systematic review. And stakeholders who, who have participated in that, or who have been part of multiple stakeholder advisory committees, and we feel that they now understand the methods enough that they could be a reviewer, partnered, as we always do, with a research member of the committee. Then we'd move them into that extra level of engagement, if we could make the engagement more intense. So we do different types of capacity building in order to try to allow our stakeholders to become more intensely engaged over time.
And just while we're talking about your project, Charlene Yusufi asked earlier, how did you as an organization decide on the 4 pillars? In other words, what KT functions your organization would support?
Well, that predates my time at the Institute, but I'll take a stab at it based on my knowledge of the history here. The Institute has had a practice of having regular review, like a 5-year review cycle, where there was an external review committee that looked at the work of the body of work of the Institute over a 5-year period, and then prepared and interviewed people in the Institute, stakeholders who were potential users of the Institute's work, and prepared a report sort of assessing the quality and quantity of the Institute's contribution over that 5-year period. And my understanding, although I wasn't here, is that 15 or 20 years ago, one of these reports said, you're doing great research, really high quality research, but we don't think that you're doing enough to get that research in the hands of people who can use it and to ensure that it's relevant to the people who can use it. So one of those 5-year review committee reports really pointed to the need to do more integrated KT in order to really make a difference. I think it also happened that at the time there was a very strong KT practitioner at the Institute, John Labus. Some of you may recognize the name because he's contributed to some important, he's done some important work in the KT literature, who was at the Institute at the time, who was able to help the organization respond to that comment. So at the time, there was a communications function and a kind of dissemination focus, but not the relationship building or integrated KT part. That part was much weaker at the time. And between the review panel and Labus's own personal expertise to help drive that forward, there was a commitment to add those 2 pillars, those key pillars around relationship building and integrated KT, and ultimately a commitment from our core funder to provide core funding for a KTE team. And then that was further developed by my predecessor, and I came on board that only about 6 or 7 years ago.
Got it. So much rides and all of this on relationship building. And Dahlia is wondering, how do or can researchers create an ongoing mechanism for engaging stakeholders, thus maintaining the relationships that Chris underscored when there is no current project or funding? And Jennifer, since your presentation started with the NIDLR staff and peer reviewers as your list of stakeholders, so clearly if one is going to be presenting a KT approach and documenting that one has the capacity of this network as part of the grant proposal, do you have any thoughts about that? So this is before you're funded.
Right. Yeah, I know that's a very challenging aspect, isn't it? And especially, with the needs knowledge model, if you look at all of the steps in there, we actually do talk about even completing the activities in those first 2 stages prior to receiving your funding. So it sort of becomes a labor of love. And in my experience, one of the best ways to maintain collaborations when there's no funding is by volunteering yourself. You become a champion for whatever cause it is you're trying to serve, right? And so whether it's, getting a little release time from whatever duties you're currently doing professionally or after hours, engaging those stakeholders, I think that's how it gets done. And I'd love to hear if there are other opportunities for that. But just as an example, I started up a collaboration with a professor at a local university other than University of Buffalo, and ended up with an inventor coming to me with a product she had designed and wanted to see if there was any market potential. So off hours, I helped her hook up with this gentleman over at the other university whose technology transfer class completed a marketing report for her. Well, in the end, in our next grant proposal, we wrote this in as a future an actual project, this collaborative project. So it was just because I was willing to put in that sort of sweat equity at the onset and be the champion for this relationship that was able to continue into an actual funded period. So I'm curious to hear what others have to say on this as well.
This is June, and I absolutely agree with what you said, and I think there is a relevant approach to putting yourself out there, either as a volunteer or board member, maybe for your local ARC, or that's in the U.S., but I have seen a lot of collaboration come out of that from different community organizations and higher education when you come together onto a board or into a voluntary role.
That's a great point, serving on boards. That's actually how my interaction with this one gentleman from the other university began, was serving on the Product Development Management Association's local chapter board. So great point. Thanks, June.
Uh-huh.
It's Chris, and I would totally agree about the volunteering thing. That's a really, really good way to stay in touch. But it doesn't always have to be that involved. And I said that my favorite question from Heather when I first talked with her was, how can I help? And I think that question can be asked periodically, just with check-ins every once in a while. It's like, hey, Chris, how's it going? Just wondering if you're up to anything new, or if there's anything, that you're thinking about that we could work on together. And just a simple check-in every once in a while like that is really helpful.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the chat box. Jess is pointing out that maybe keeping the involvement through the debrief when a grant is rejected increases their knowledge of the process, and she's responding to Heather. I wonder if anyone has advice about how to encourage partnership when a partnered grant has been rejected. I'm always worried that academics are used to rejection, while rejection for our partners can be very unmotivating and very disappointing. Obviously we're talking about KT and talking about relationship building in this specific context, but it does strike me that this is just true in general, and that in some ways applying for a grant is like applying for a job, and they want you to have experience before you even can get the job, so you do the internship or the volunteering and build your network and talk to lots of people, which might address Pimjai's question earlier when she was saying, I'm talking about the president or administrator of the organization, who's usually the committed person with the project, and if that's your point of contact with the organization, what do you do if that person leaves? And Chris, you already pointed out, well, try to have, relationships with more than one person, or perhaps it might be more than one organization. So some of it is just showing up at conferences like this and putting yourself out there. Because Dahlia is agreeing, a good suggestion, Jessica, it can help the entire grant team to understand what areas to improve and keeps the partners engaged afterwards. So again, it's sharing the information about what happened to that grant so they understand as well. We do have about 5 more minutes. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I think we've addressed all that have been raised earlier in the afternoon. We do have these other 2 questions, right? So how might one use the information that was presented? Dahlia or June or anyone else on the phone, did you prepare an answer to that we haven't been able to discuss yet? Has the conversation have you rolled your comments already in?
This is Dahlia. For me, I think I rolled it into some of my comments and also questions about that communication piece and whose job is it to communicate and can that role be shared. So I really appreciated Jennifer's response.
Thank you.
This is June, and I just had a comment after listening to all 3 presentations, and that is that we need to be very cautious about using proxies. So there were some challenges that were brought up about engaging patients, clients, consumer reps throughout the presentations, and understanding that one person has difficulty representing a larger group. It's also really important to have the actual voice of the individuals we serve to be at the table through that entire planning, implementation, analyzing process. I've seen it done really well several times. One of the researchers that comes to my mind is Dr. Gordon Bonham, who had a project with Maryland Rehabilitation State Group. I don't remember exactly what their name was, but it was called the Ask Me Project. And they used individuals with developmental disabilities to actually conduct some of the research. So if you Googled it, there's information out there. And I just wanted to put that push out there because I heard Dr. McBride make a statement that he said that co-responsibility and co-production is the antecedent to tokenism. And I think that statement is also so valuable when we apply it to our clients.
Absolutely. And it does, that comment helps us to address our third question, how can overcoming barriers to outreach improve the lives of people with disabilities? You know, Chris, did you want to elaborate on June's point about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the co-production of knowledge is one of the major facilitators to overcoming barriers. And when you have the voice of people with lived experience involved, then you're going to get a lot of things right in the project. Whereas if you're just making assumptions on what you think would be the priorities or the language or whatever, without having them involved, you're opening yourself up to a lot of pitfalls that will create more barriers than will be overcome.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like it would increase the relevance of what is being produced, whether it be a developed product or findings that we hope people will pick up and use. And in that outreach, Heather is pointing out that we can be clear at the risk of grants on the front end. We need to ensure that the whole group knows that not everything is funded. But of course, you know, back to the point when we were talking about that you need the relationship before you can apply for the grant. So nothing is ever lost in developing these relationships. You know, then you have that, and you can turn around and think through, well, if that grant didn't come through, what might make sense moving forward. So I think we do need to wrap things up for the day, unless there's something, you know, that somebody really needs to correct or clarify. All right. Well, thanks so much to Dahlia and June for thinking through these questions ahead of time. We really appreciate your thoughtful comments and discussion. I don't think the NIDLR Interim Director, Christy Wilson-Hill, or our Project Director, Sanjay Satsawat, are on the line anymore, but we obviously appreciate them joining us at the beginning of the afternoon. And I want to give big thanks to our moderator for today, Joanne Starks, who basically runs this show. We really appreciate the presenters today, Chris and Ron and Jennifer, especially for staying on till the, I wouldn't say bitter end, I'm going to say the sweet end, right, of our afternoon. And really to everyone on the line, we really hope that today's session and this discussion has been useful to you, that you can take it and apply it to overcoming barriers to outreach associated with NIDLR-funded work or whatever pays your paycheck. And all of you, so please do join us for day 2 of the conference, which is not tomorrow. It's on Wednesday, but it's during the same hours from 1 to 5 p.m. Eastern using the same link, same logon credentials. Our theme for the day on Wednesday is Tools for Tracking Implementation. And we'll be joined by grantees from the Libre project at Boston and Harvard Universities, Louis Cazas, Mary Slavin, Colleen Ryan, and Jeffrey Schneider. And then we'll hear from Alan Heineman and Linda Ehrlich from the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. They will be talking about their rehabilitation measures database. Then we'll end the afternoon's presentations with a really great theoretical presentation on knowledge translation. It's really a not miss. It goes into all its complexities from Diane Feingood of Simon Fraser University. And then to wrap up the day, we'll have another interactive discussion like this one, but we'll be joined by Mark Harness of the University of Washington Center for Technology and Disability Studies. He's also co-director of the Americans with Disabilities Act Knowledge Translation Center. And Peg Nozick, who's been active today, thanks Peg, she's with the Baylor College of Medicine and the executive director of the Center for Research on Women with Disabilities, or CROWD. And Ariel Silverman has been with us today as well, so she'll be talking on the phone on Wednesday with us, and she represents her Disability Wisdom Consulting. So please join us. Thanks so much.